It was supposed to be a quiet escape, just a weekend away from the noise, from the constant pressure of the city, from everything. I had found a cabin, a small, unassuming place tucked away deep in the woods. It was perfect. At least, that's what I thought. But the woods have a way of holding secrets. And sometimes, those secrets don't stay hidden for long. Before I go deeper into the story, welcome, and make sure to subscribe to the channel, Echoes of Nightmares, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on any of the future scary tales. If you're enjoying this story, hit that like button too. Also, leave a comment to let me know where you're listening from in the world. Now, back to my story. I remember the drive there so vividly. The rain had just started to fall, soft and steady, as if welcoming me to this secluded retreat. The forest felt endless, with towering trees that seemed to close in the further I drove. It was peaceful, quiet, almost too quiet. But I told myself that's exactly what I needed. A place where no one could reach me, where the only sound would be the rain and the wind brushing through the trees. As I reached the cabin, I felt a wave of relief. It was exactly as the photos had shown, old, rustic, and isolated. The kind of place where you could disappear for a while. I stepped out of the car, breathing in the cool, damp air, the kind that feels clean and heavy all at once. The rain had picked up by then, tapping lightly on the roof of the cabin like a gentle greeting. I remember thinking, this is going to be perfect, but there was something else, something I couldn't place at the time. A feeling like the woods were watching me. I ignored it, of course. I laughed it off as nothing more than my imagination. I had no reason to think otherwise. I was alone, or at least that's what I told myself. And in that moment, I truly believed it. What happened next changed everything. This is the story of what I experienced. A weekend that started as an escape and became something I can't fully explain. Sit back, listen closely, and let me tell you what happened in that cabin. While the rain fell, it wasn't just me. I wasn't alone this time. Lena and Mark, my closest friends, had been looking forward to this trip as much as I had. We were all desperate for a break, each of us weighed down by the grind of our daily lives. Mark had found the cabin online, a quaint little place advertised as charming and remote, perfect for unwinding. It was an easy sell. The photos showed a cozy, wood-paneled interior, a crackling stone fireplace, and wide windows overlooking endless stretches of forest. The listing promised serenity, and we all needed it. Lena loved the idea of escaping her phone for a few days. Mark, ever the adventurer, was thrilled about hiking in the surrounding woods. And I just wanted the noise to stop. I wanted peace. So, we packed our bags, loaded up the car, and set out that Friday afternoon, full of anticipation. The drive started out as most road trips do. Playful banter, loud music, and snacks passed around. The highway eventually gave way to winding country roads. As the trees thickened, our signal bars vanished one by one. Lena joked that we were driving straight into the middle of nowhere. Mark laughed, saying, "That's the point, isn't it?" The further we drove, the quieter it became. The trees seemed taller out here, their branches arching over the narrow road like a canopy. The rain began to fall steadily, light enough to hear, but not enough to worry about. The GPS announced, "You've arrived," just as the road ended in a small clearing. And there was the cabin. At first glance, it was perfect, just like the photos. Small but inviting, with warm yellow light spilling from its windows. The rain made everything look softer, almost dreamlike. We grabbed our bags and made our way inside. The cabin smelled faintly of cedar and damp wood. It was exactly as described. Rustic, cozy, with a hint of old charm. But there was something else too, something I couldn't put my finger on. Mark was already exploring, admiring the stone fireplace and the antique furniture. Lena found the kitchen and called out, "Guys, there's fresh bread here." I lingered in the living room, running my fingers over the polished wood of a coffee table, noticing little things, the odd, mismatched decor, the faint creak of the floorboards, the way the rain sounded almost amplified through the windows. But it wasn't until Lena found the guest book that I started to feel uneasy. The guest book was sitting on a small side table by the door. It was an old leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. Lena flipped it open, expecting to find cheerful messages from past visitors. And there were some notes about how peaceful the cabin was, how lovely the woods were, how they'd love to come back. But as she turned the pages, the tone of the entries changed. One message read, "Nice place, but don't stay past dark." Another, "We heard noises at night. Thought it was animals, but it wasn't." Mark laughed it off. "People love to freak each other out with these kinds of notes," he said. Lena shrugged and set the book aside, but I could see it in her face. She wasn't convinced. Neither was I. The cabin wasn't perfect. It was old, after all. The floorboards creaked with every step. The windows rattled faintly whenever the wind picked up. There were scratches on the walls, long, uneven marks that might have been made by furniture, but looked deliberate. And then there was the local. We'd only just started settling in when there was a knock at the door. Mark opened it to find a man standing there, soaked from the rain, holding a lantern. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with deep lines etched into his face and eyes that didn't quite meet yours when he spoke. He introduced himself as the neighbor from down the road. We never caught his name. He told us to enjoy our stay, but gave a strange warning before he left. "Make sure you're inside before the rain really comes down. The woods aren't safe at night." Lena asked what he meant, but he just tipped his hat and walked away, disappearing into the trees. Mark shook his head. "People in these small towns love their ghost stories," he said. I wanted to agree with him, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my chest. We brushed it off, of course. We told ourselves it was nothing, just the quirks of an old cabin and the superstitions of a small-town local. But that night, as the rain fell harder and the woods grew darker, I began to wonder if we should have paid closer attention. The first night felt endless. The rain had picked up, and it wasn't the soothing kind. It pounded against the roof in relentless sheets, drowning out nearly every other sound. We decided to stay in, lighting a fire in the stone fireplace and playing cards to pass the time. Mark joked about the old man's warning, but Lena seemed uneasy, glancing at the windows every so often. It was just after midnight when Lena said she heard something. Faint, almost imperceptible, a soft crunching sound like footsteps on wet leaves, coming from just outside. "It's probably just deer," Mark said, barely looking up from his cards. But I noticed Lena wasn't convinced. She stood by the window for a long time, staring into the rain-soaked darkness before finally sitting back down. The next strange thing happened just as we were getting ready for bed. Mark was the first to notice it. A window in the kitchen that we knew had been closed was now open. Water had pooled on the counter beneath it, and the damp curtains swayed slightly in the cold breeze. "Did someone forget to lock it?" Mark asked, but none of us had even been in the kitchen since we arrived. He shrugged, pulling the window shut and locking it tight. But for the first time, his carefree demeanor seemed to crack, just a little. We tried to shake it off, telling ourselves that maybe it hadn't been latched properly to begin with. But as we were rearranging the living room rug, preparing to sit by the fire again, Mark suddenly stopped. "What's this?" he said, pointing to a small iron ring embedded in the wooden floor. We pulled the rug back completely, revealing a trapdoor. It was old, the wood discolored and warped, with deep scratches marring its surface. There was no mistaking it. It led to a basement. "It's probably just storage," Mark said, though he didn't sound convinced. The trapdoor was locked with a heavy padlock, the kind you'd expect to see on a storage unit or an old gate. None of us wanted to admit it out loud, but something about that trapdoor felt wrong. We left it alone, pulling the rug back over it. and decided not to think about it. But the unease had settled in by then, and it wasn't going anywhere. The power went out just after 2 a.m. The cabin was plunged into darkness, save for the faint, flickering glow of the fireplace. Mark grabbed his phone to use as a flashlight, muttering about old wiring. Lena and I stayed by the fire, listening to the rain hammering the roof and the windows. That's when we heard it, a faint, rhythmic scratching sound coming from the walls. Probably tree branches, Mark said, shining his light toward the nearest wall. But there were no trees close enough to scrape against the cabin. The scratching grew louder, then stopped. It was followed by something worse, a slow, deliberate thud, like a hand knocking on wood. But it wasn't at the door, it was coming from beneath us. We froze. None of us spoke for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Mark shook his head. "This place is just old," he said. "Wood expands when it's wet. That's probably what we're hearing." He said it with confidence, but I could tell he didn't believe it. Neither did I. We decided to go to bed, though none of us really slept. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, I heard Lena gasp. "What is it?" I whispered. Sitting up, she held up her phone, the screen glowing faintly in the dark. She'd left it on the nightstand, or so she thought. But now it was in her hands, with a single phrase typed on the screen. "You're not alone." Lena's hands were trembling. "I didn't type this," she said. Her voice was barely audible over the sound of the rain. We stayed up until dawn, huddled in the living room with the fire burning low. None of us wanted to admit how scared we were. When the rain finally let up, Mark stepped outside to check for damage. That's when he heard it, the unmistakable sound of a child's laughter. It was faint, carried on the wind, and it seemed to be coming from the woods. Mark called out, but there was no response. He came back inside, his face pale. "Did you see anything?" Lena asked. "No," Mark said. "There's no one out there." But we all knew what we'd heard. The laughter echoed in our minds long after it had stopped, leaving a silence that felt heavier than the rain ever had. We were trying to stay calm. Mark insisted it was just the stress of the trip, maybe combined with the storm. But Lena wasn't buying it. Neither was I. Something was wrong with that cabin, and we were only just beginning to understand how deep it went. By the second night, we were barely holding it together. The storm had grown worse, thunder rattling the windows and lightning streaking across the sky. None of us wanted to admit it, but we knew we couldn't stay here another night. It was Lena who brought it up first, the trapdoor. She couldn't stop thinking about it. "There's something down there," she said, her voice trembling. "What if it explains all of this?" Mark shook his head. "We don't need to know," he said firmly. "We just need to leave." But Lena wasn't backing down. She grabbed the flashlight and pulled the rug aside, revealing the trapdoor once more. She knelt down and tugged at the padlock. To our shock, it fell off easily, as if it hadn't been locked at all. Mark and I exchanged uneasy glances. We didn't want to go down there. But Lena had already made up her mind. The basement smelled of damp earth and decay. The flashlight beam danced across rough wooden steps and walls lined with shelves holding rotting, unidentifiable objects. At the far end of the room was an old wooden chest. Lena approached it cautiously, her breath visible in the freezing air. She lifted the lid, revealing a bundle of items: a worn journal, a rusted lantern, and a cracked photograph of a family standing in front of the cabin. She flipped open the journal. The handwriting was uneven, frantic. It described ghostly sightings, shadowy figures in the woods, whispers in the night, and strange noises coming from the walls. The last entry read, "If you're reading this, leave now. It doesn't want you here." Before we could react, a deafening bang came from above, shaking the entire cabin. We scrambled up the stairs, slamming the trapdoor shut behind us. The banging continued, louder, more insistent, coming from the front door. Mark locked the door and pulled a chair in front of it, his face pale. Who is it? Lena whispered, clutching the journal. I don't know, Mark replied, his voice barely audible over the storm. But deep down, we all knew there was no one outside. The banging stopped suddenly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. And then we heard it, footsteps. But they weren't coming from the porch. They were coming from inside the cabin. The three of us froze, our eyes darting around the room. The shadows seemed to move, shifting in the flickering firelight. And then we heard it, our names, whispered one by one, coming from the darkest corner of the room. Lena, Mark, David. A figure stepped into the light, a dark, shadowy shape that seemed to absorb the glow from the fireplace. It didn't walk so much as glide, its head tilting unnaturally as it moved closer. Lena screamed, and the lights flickered back on. That's when we saw them, bloody handprints smeared across every wall, dripping down like fresh paint. Mark grabbed a fire poker, swinging it wildly, but the figure didn't flinch. Instead, it let out a low, guttural laugh that sent chills down my spine. You shouldn't have come, it said, its voice a horrible mix of whispers and growls. In a blind panic, we barricaded ourselves in the bedroom, shoving the bed and dresser against the door. We have to get out of here, Lena said, her voice shaking. Mark nodded, already prying open the window. The storm outside was relentless, rain lashing against the glass. But it didn't matter. Staying in that cabin wasn't an option. We climbed out one by one, the freezing rain drenching us instantly. As I turned back to look at the cabin, I saw it, the figure standing in the window, watching us. Its face was a twisted, featureless void, but I could feel its gaze, cold and unforgiving. It raised one hand, pressing it against the glass. Blood smeared across the window as it whispered, one last time. You're not alone. We ran, slipping and stumbling through the mud, not stopping until we reached the car. Mark fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking, and we sped away without looking back. The cabin disappeared behind us, swallowed by the storm. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that we didn't really leave it behind. Sometimes late at night, I still hear it, the scratching, the whispers, the sound of my name spoken from the darkness. We didn't stop running. The storm was relentless, soaking us to the bone as we stumbled through the forest. The trees seemed alive, their gnarled branches clawing at us as we passed. Behind us, the cabin was eerily silent. But we weren't alone. The shadows moved just at the edges of our vision. And then the sound began, a low, guttural growl, followed by heavy, crunching footsteps that matched our every move. Don't look back, Mark said, his voice shaking. Just keep going. Lena tripped, falling into the mud, and I turned to help her up. That's when I saw it. A figure, impossibly tall and thin, its head cocked unnaturally to the side, standing between the trees. Its face was featureless, but I could feel its gaze, cold and relentless, boring into me. I grabbed Lena, pulling her to her feet, and we ran faster than I thought possible. When we finally reached the car, Mark was already there, frantically trying to unlock the doors. His hands were shaking so badly that he dropped the keys. I snatched them up, my fingers fumbling as I shoved them into the lock. We piled in, slamming the doors shut just as the figure emerged from the treeline. For a moment, it just stood there, motionless, as if daring us to stay. Then it began to move, not walking, but gliding toward us, its movements unnaturally smooth. Go! Lena screamed, and I didn't need to be told twice. The tires spun in the mud before catching, and we sped off, the cabin disappearing into the storm behind us. But as we reached the main road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin lights were on, glowing warmly against the rain, as if nothing had ever happened. For days after, None of us could talk about what happened. It felt like a nightmare, something our minds refused to process. But Lena couldn't let it go. She spent hours online, digging into the cabin's history. And what she found only made things worse. The cabin, it turned out, had a reputation. A dark one. Stories of guests disappearing without a trace. Locals refusing to go near it. There were rumors of occult rituals, of something ancient tied to the land. One article caught her attention, a photo of the cabin from the 1960s, with a family standing in front of it. It was the same family from the photograph we found in the basement. And then, buried in the comments section of a forgotten forum thread, she found a chilling message. If you survive, don't look back. Don't go digging for answers. It's always watching. Lena closed her laptop, her face pale. She refused to speak about it after that. As for me, I can't forget. Sometimes, late at night, I'll wake up to the sound of rain tapping against the windows. And for a moment, I'm back there in that cabin. And sometimes, when the wind howls just right, I hear it again, my name, whispered from the darkness. We weren't the first to survive that place, but we may not be the last. If you ever find yourself looking for a remote cabin getaway, take my advice. Read the reviews. And if the cabin seems too quiet, too secluded, too perfect, just remember, some places are meant to be left alone. We thought the nightmare was over when we left that cabin behind. But what we didn't know, what no one ever told us, was that leaving doesn't mean escaping. Lena refuses to talk about it now, and Mark acts like it never happened. But I've noticed small things that don't feel right. The smell of damp wood, faint scratches on the walls, the sound of rain on a clear night. And sometimes, just before I drift off to sleep, I feel it, a presence, standing silently in the corner of the room, watching, waiting. They say the cabin is still there, standing in that same clearing, waiting for its next guests. What happened to the others who stayed there? Well, that's a story for another time. Have you ever had a similar experience? Something you can't explain, something that still haunts you to this day. I want to hear your story. Share it in the comments below, and who knows, it might just inspire our next video. And if you enjoyed this tale, or if it kept you up tonight, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. There are many more chilling stories waiting to be told, and you won't want to miss them. Sometimes, the places we leave behind don't let go.